Hi there. Please let your mind slow down and go at ease, and let me know in the comments where you're from. Also, what's your best tip for a peaceful night's sleep and keeping a calm mind? Whether it's a relaxing bedtime ritual, a favorite book, or a mindfulness practice, your advice could be just what someone needs. The haunted hotel room. I had been traveling for hours, road-weary and exhausted, when I stumbled upon an old, towering hotel in the middle of a small, isolated town. It wasn't on the map, and I hadn't planned on stopping, but the thought of a real bed and a hot shower was too tempting to resist. The hotel had a grand, old-fashioned charm. Ornate woodwork, red velvet carpets, and crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, flickering light over everything. The front desk clerk, an elderly man with deep-set eyes and a voice barely above a whisper, checked me in with a somber look. "Room 207, he murmured, handing me an old-fashioned key. There was a strange pause as he looked at me, as if he wanted to say something but changed his mind. "Sleep well," he added, though his tone suggested anything but a restful night. I shrugged it off, too tired to care, and took the creaky old elevator up to the second floor. The hallways were dimly lit, lined with faded wallpaper and long stretching shadows. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Finally, I reached room 207 and unlocked the door. Inside, the room was quiet, almost too quiet. It was quaint, decorated in an old Victorian style with a single bed, a dresser, and a large mirror that took up most of one wall. A dusty, worn armchair sat by the window, and as I closed the door, I noticed the strange chill in the air. I turned on the lamp by the bed, its soft yellow glow casting long shadows across the room. Exhausted, I dropped my bags and made my way to the bathroom. But as I passed the mirror, I froze. For a brief second, I thought I saw something. An outline of a figure standing behind me, barely visible, like a faint shadow. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. Laughing nervously, I chalked it up to fatigue and splashed some cold water on my face, telling myself I was just imagining things. I climbed into bed, the covers cold and musty, and closed my eyes, eager to get some rest. But as I lay there, the silence seemed to grow heavier, filling the room with an oppressive weight. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a faint, dragging sound coming from the far corner of the room. My eyes snapped open, and I listened, my breath caught in my throat. The sound grew louder, moving closer, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I sat up, straining to see in the dim light. The armchair by the window was empty, but the air around it seemed darker, almost thicker, as if something invisible lingered there, watching me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks, but the dragging sound continued, relentless, moving closer to the bed. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence returned, but it felt different, charged, tense, like the room itself was holding its breath. I lay back down, my heart pounding, and pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to shake the fear that clawed at my mind. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes again, the room was dark. The lamp had gone out, and I could barely make out the outline of the furniture in the faint light from the window. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable, but as I shifted, I felt it. A weight on the edge of the bed, pressing down on the mattress as though someone were sitting beside me. Frozen with terror, I held my breath, too afraid to move. I could feel the presence beside me, its cold, heavy weight seeping through the blankets, and then I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, barely audible, right by my ear. "Get out." The word sent a shock of fear through me, and I bolted upright, scrambling out of bed. I grabbed my things, not bothering to pack, and raced out of the room, the door slamming shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I was out of the hotel, standing under the streetlights, gasping for breath. When I looked back, the window to room 207 was dark, but I could feel it, the presence, watching me, lingering in the shadows. I left the town that night and never looked back, but the memory of that whisper, that chilling presence beside me in the bed, haunts me to this day. The old woman on the train. It was late, the kind of night where the world feels muted and blurred, and I was riding the last train home, the carriage almost empty, save for a few tired commuters. The lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows over the seats. I settled into my seat, leaning against the window as I watched the dark countryside whip by. Just as the train was pulling away from a small, empty station, the doors slid open, and an old woman shuffled in. She was hunched over, her face hidden beneath the hood, her clothes tattered and worn. She moved slowly, her steps measured, almost hesitant, as though each step took a great deal of effort. She sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. I tried not to stare, but there was something unsettling about her presence, an air of sadness and something darker. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge me, but I felt her presence keenly, as if she were waiting for something. The train rattled along, the lights flickering, and I found myself glancing at her every few minutes, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her hands were pale, almost too pale, like they belonged to a statue rather than a person. And her fingers, they were long, unnaturally long, tapering to sharp, bony points that rested motionless on her lap. The train slowed as we approached another empty station, and for a moment I thought she might leave. But as the doors opened, she remained seated, her gaze still fixed on the floor. Then slowly she raised her head and our eyes met. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes sunken and dark, as though she hadn't slept in years. She stared at me with a hollow, empty gaze, and I felt a chill run down my spine, my body freezing under her unblinking stare. "Are you lost?" I managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. She tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. "Not lost," she murmured, her voice soft and brittle, like the sound of dry leaves rustling. "Waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, feeling an inexplicable urge to understand, though every instinct told me to look away, to leave her alone. Her gaze shifted, her eyes flicking toward the window, watching the darkness pass by. "They always come," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They find me, sooner or later. I had no idea what she meant, but the way she spoke, the sadness and finality in her tone, filled me with a strange, creeping dread. The train rattled along, and the lights flickered again, plunging us into darkness for a brief, terrifying moment. When they came back on, the seat across from me was empty. I blinked, looking around, but she was gone, as if she had vanished into thin air. My heart pounded as I glanced around the empty carriage, searching for any sign of her. But there was nothing, just the empty seat and the faint echo of her voice lingering in the air. I spent the rest of the ride in silence, my mind racing, replaying our conversation, the look in her eyes, the way she had disappeared. When I finally reached my stop, I hurried off the train, feeling a sense of relief as I stepped onto the platform. But just as the train pulled away, I caught a glimpse of the carriage's window, and there she was, the old woman sitting in her seat, her hollow eyes fixed on me, her mouth twisted into a faint smile. I don't ride the late train anymore, and when I see an empty carriage pass, I look away. But sometimes I feel her watching, waiting, her eyes filled with the sadness of someone who has been forgotten, bound to the endless journey of the last train, forever. The locked door in the basement. When my grandmother passed away, I inherited her old house. It was a creaky, sprawling Victorian, filled with hidden nooks and crannies, rooms that seemed tucked away in places no architect would ever design. The house had been in our family for generations, and as a child, I'd always found it enchanting, even magical. But coming back as an adult, it felt different, darker, quieter, like the house was hiding something. As I wandered through the rooms, memories surfaced, playing hide and seek with my cousins, the smell of my grandmother's perfume, the way the floorboards creaked in specific spots. But there was one place I'd never been allowed as a child, the basement. I remembered the door, heavy and padlocked, with strict orders never to enter. My grandmother would get angry if anyone even asked about it. Curiosity gnawed at me. After weeks of tiptoeing around it, I finally gathered the courage to go down. The lock was still there, rusty but strong. I found an old iron key on my grandmother's dresser, buried under piles of handkerchiefs and trinkets, and tried it, not really expecting it to work. But to my surprise, it clicked open. The basement was cold and dark, filled with an earthy smell that made my nose wrinkle. The steps were steep, and as I descended, each creak of the wood seemed louder than the last. My flashlight beam flickered over old shelves lined with jars, dusty boxes, and forgotten tools. I walked carefully, feeling the stillness close in, thick and heavy, as though the air hadn't been disturbed in decades. In the far corner of the room, I saw another door. It was small and plain, made of dark wood, and had no visible handle or lock. I approached it slowly, feeling a strange pull, a sense of something lying in wait just beyond. I raised my hand, pressing my palm against the wood. It was cold, too cold, as though something unnatural radiated from within. I felt an inexplicable urge to open it, to see what was on the other side. But just as I was about to push, I heard a faint sound. A soft, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy pressing against the door from the other side. My heart pounded and I took a step back, my flashlight flickering. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was on the other side knew I was there. I stumbled back, bumping into shelves and sending a cloud of dust into the air. As I turned to leave, a whisper drifted through the room, faint but unmistakable, as if spoken directly into my ear. "Don't leave me." I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I looked around, searching for the source. The basement was empty, silent. The voice was familiar, soft, pleading, filled with a sadness that struck a deep chord in me. It almost sounded like my grandmother's voice. "Please, don't leave me," it whispered again, a hint of desperation seeping into the words. My throat tightened, and despite every instinct telling me to run, I felt myself drawn back toward the door. The thumping had stopped, replaced by a soft, sorrowful sobbing, a sound that echoed through the darkness, filling the room with a hollow ache. I reached out, fingers brushing against the wood, and in that moment I felt something, a hand, small and icy, pressing back from the other side. I gasped, stumbling backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor and plunging the room into darkness. In the faint glow of the fallen flashlight, I saw it, a shadowy figure, barely visible, standing just in front of the door. It was a woman, her features blurred and indistinct, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching with a sadness that seemed endless, timeless. With a surge of panic, I scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it with trembling hands. I could still hear her voice, muffled but pleading, calling out to me as I stumbled through the house, her words echoing in my mind. I haven't gone back to the basement since, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear her voice drifting up from the floorboards, whispering the same plea over and over. "Don't leave me. Please, don't leave me." The house at the end of Candlewood Lane. Growing up, we'd all heard the stories about the house at the end of Candlewood Lane. It was a rambling, decaying mansion, overgrown with ivy and surrounded by tall, looming trees that blocked it from the street. Kids would dare each other to run up to the house and touch the door, but nobody ever went inside. We all knew it was haunted, though none of us could explain how we knew. One summer night, my friends and I decided we were old enough, brave enough, to finally explore the house. We met at the edge of the yard, armed with flashlights and cheap courage, and made our way up the winding path that led to the front steps. The house loomed over us, its windows dark and empty, like eyes watching our every move. The door creaked open as we pushed it, revealing a grand but crumbling foyer. The air was thick with dust, and our flashlights barely pierced the darkness, casting strange, dancing shadows over the walls. We moved deeper into the house, whispering nervously, our footsteps echoing in the vast silence. We split up, each of us exploring a different room. The house was massive, filled with abandoned furniture and broken mirrors, walls lined with old portraits of people long gone. I felt uneasy, like the eyes in those portraits were following me, judging me. But I brushed it off, determined not to let my friends see my fear. As I entered what looked like a study, I noticed a large, ornate mirror against one wall. Its surface was clouded with dust, but as I approached, I saw a faint outline in the glass. An outline that didn't match my reflection. I wiped the dust away and froze. The figure in the mirror was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face pale and sorrowful. She stared at me, her dark eyes filled with a sadness so deep it seemed to pull me in, making my chest ache. She raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, her gaze never leaving mine. I backed away, heart pounding, but her hand remained pressed against the mirror, her eyes pleading. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a voice, soft, faint, almost drowned out by the creaks and groans of the old house. "Stay," it whispered, the word filled with longing. I shivered, glancing back at the mirror, but the figure was gone, leaving only my own reflection staring back at me. I stumbled out of the room, rejoining my friends in the hallway. They looked as shaken as I felt, their faces pale, their eyes darting around the shadowed corners of the house. We didn't say a word, each of us sensing that something was wrong, something unnatural. Just as we were about to leave, a loud bang echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming down the staircase. We turned, flashlights trembling as we aimed them at the stairs. A shadow moved at the top, growing larger as it descended. Each step slow, measured, as though savoring our fear. We bolted, racing through the foyer and out the door, the sound of footsteps following us, echoing through the empty house. I glanced back as we reached the yard, catching a final glimpse of a figure standing in the doorway, watching us with dark, hollow eyes. To this day, none of us talk about what happened in that house. We left Candlewood Lane behind, moved on with our lives. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of that house. I see the woman in the mirror, her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes filled with that same haunting sadness. And when I wake, I can still hear her voice, whispering that single, desperate word, "Stay." The visitor at the window. I had just moved into my new apartment, a cozy little place on the 3rd floor of an older building. It had charm, vintage fixtures, big windows, creaky wooden floors. It was exactly what I wanted. Peaceful, tucked away from the noise of the city. The first few nights were blissfully quiet, and I quickly fell into a routine, feeling at home. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught a glimpse of movement outside my bedroom window. It was just a flash, a shadow passing by, quick and silent. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a tree branch swaying in the wind, but an uneasy feeling lingered, making it hard to fall asleep. Over the next few days, I noticed it again, a flicker of movement, always just on the edge of my vision, right outside my window. The thing that made my skin crawl, though, was that my window faced out over a 3-story drop. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing but open air below it. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I turned off my bedroom light and slowly, cautiously approached the window. Peering through the glass, I saw nothing, just the faint glow of streetlights and the quiet, empty street below. I felt silly, almost embarrassed for letting my imagination get the better of me. But just as I was about to turn away, I saw it again. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the glass, staring in at me with dark, hollow eyes. My heart lurched, and I stumbled back, gasping for breath. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, its face expressionless, its gaze locked onto mine. I forced myself to look again, but the figure was gone, leaving only my own pale reflection staring back at me. I shut the blinds, trying to shake off the unease, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow from the street below. But the fear gnawed at me, refusing to let go. Over the next few nights, I kept the blinds closed, too afraid to look. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I could feel it, that presence lingering just beyond the glass, watching, waiting. The air in my bedroom grew colder, the silence heavier, pressing down on me, filling the room with a dark, oppressive weight. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a faint tapping at the window, soft but deliberate. My heart pounded as I stared at the closed blinds, dread building with each tap. I held my breath, praying it would stop, that it was just the wind or a branch scraping against the glass. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, like something desperate, something that wanted to be let in. I pulled the covers over my head, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. Finally, the tapping stopped, leaving only silence, thick and suffocating. The next morning, I opened the blinds, half expecting to see nothing out of the ordinary. But on the glass, smeared in a dark, oily substance, was a handprint, long fingers splayed wide, pressed against the window from the outside. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and I backed away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. I moved out of that apartment not long after. I couldn't take the feeling of being watched, of that presence lurking just beyond the glass. Even now, I avoid windows at night, too afraid of what I might see staring back at me from the darkness. The photograph in the attic. After my father passed away, I inherited the old family home, a grand, sprawling house filled with decades of memories and, as it turned out, a few secrets. The house was packed with knickknacks, antiques, and boxes of things that hadn't been touched in years. While sorting through his belongings, I decided to explore the attic, a dusty, forgotten place filled with family heirlooms and old furniture. The attic was dimly lit, with beams of sunlight filtering through cracks in the roof, casting strange shadows over the cluttered space. As I sifted through the boxes, I came across a small, old-fashioned photograph tucked into a dusty frame. It was a black and white picture of a young woman, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes dark and strangely intense. The odd thing was, I didn't recognize her. She wasn't part of any family photos, and I couldn't recall ever seeing her face before. I stared at the photograph, feeling a strange connection to her, like she was watching me, aware of my presence. I shook off the feeling and tucked the picture back into the box, deciding to ask my mother about it later. That night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint sound coming from upstairs, the creak of floorboards as though someone were walking through the attic. I told myself it was just the house settling, the old wood expanding and contracting in the cool night air. But the creaking continued, steady, deliberate, moving across the ceiling directly above my bed. Unable to ignore it, I got up, grabbing a flashlight, and made my way upstairs, I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, my heart pounding as I pushed open the door, expecting to see nothing but shadows and dust. But as my flashlight beam swept over the room, I froze. There, in the center of the attic, was the photograph, leaning against an empty box, its frame slightly tilted. I hadn't left it there. In fact, I distinctly remembered placing it in a different box far across the room. I moved closer, my hands trembling as I picked it up, examining the face in the picture. The woman's eyes seemed darker, more intense, as though she were angry. Her expression had shifted, the faintest hint of a scowl curling at the corners of her mouth. I felt a chill seep into my bones, and I placed the photograph back in its box, carefully shutting the lid before backing out of the attic. The next morning, I tried to forget about it, brushing it off as my imagination, a trick of the light. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen around the house. Lights would flicker, doors would creak open on their own, and the air grew colder, heavier, as though something unseen lingered just out of sight. Then, one night, I heard it, a soft, faint whisper drifting through the silence. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was low, filled with anger, sadness, and something darker. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room, pressing in around me. Desperate to find answers, I went back to the attic, determined to get rid of the photograph. But when I opened the box, it was gone. I searched every inch of the attic, but there was no sign of the picture. It was as though it had vanished into thin air. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I felt a cold presence beside me. I turned, and there, at the edge of the bed, was the woman from the photograph, her face pale and sorrowful, her eyes filled with an anger that seemed endless. She reached out, her hand brushing against my shoulder, and I felt an icy chill seep into my skin. I don't remember much of what happened next. I woke up the next morning, alone, the house silent, but the memory of her touch, of her cold, hollow gaze, haunted me. I left the house shortly after, leaving everything behind. They say the past has a way of lingering, of holding on to those who disturb it. And sometimes, late at night, I still feel her presence, her eyes watching, her voice whispering, reminding me that some secrets are better left forgotten.